welcome to the SCORE V2 webinar event. My name is Brian Beckham. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Brainjocks and the SCORE product owner. And today I will be presenting some of the new SCORE V2 features with Anastasiya Ropatenko.
I'm a senior developer here at Brainjocks, and I'm on the SCORE team.
Yeah, and Anastasia specifically had a lot of work in SCORE V2, working on the component framework and some new features. And we're actually going to do a couple things today. We're going to go through the feature set and talk about what's new in V2, and we're going to do some live demonstrations of those features, and we're also going to have a live coding exercise for those of you who are interested in the new CCF framework, so we'll get deeper into that. So before we get started on the notes, just a couple of little housekeeping things. So number one, the webinar system here should allow you to submit requests or questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of hold those questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll go back and answer as many as possible. And if we don't get to all of the questions, please don't worry. Number one, we're going to record this webinar, and if everything goes well, then we'll put it out on YouTube. And number two, we'll send a list of all the questions and then answers to the questions out to all the meeting participants after, even the ones that we don't get to actually talk about in the webinar. Okay, so we'll make that transcript available for you guys. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so there's a number of things that we addressed in SCORE V2, and it originally started out as SCORE version 1.6. But the changes and the new features became significant enough that we decided to promote this out to a new release. Some of the things that we've done are completely new features, completely new ways of thinking about components, and really builds on the fundamentals in Brainjocks SCORE. So we're going to show some things that are completely new, some more education material coming, new blogs, new videos, new SCORE University videos that are going to follow this as well. But we wanted to give everybody this chance to see the new features first and foremost, so that you would understand the context of how they're delivered and what they actually do. Okay, so we're going to start off with our Sitecore support for 8.1. Now, as many of you know, 8.1 was released not too long ago, and Sitecore has touted this release as the most tested release of Sitecore ever. And they've pushed a lot of clients to move to it, to upgrade to it, and it also has some very important features in it as well. Specifically, Sitecore has now offered support for MVC areas. Now, as you know, with SCORE, we've supported MVC area for a long time, and the Sitecore version is actually an adaptation of something that we put in the marketplace a long time ago. We will continue to support MVC areas for all versions of Sitecore from 7.1 and up. And when you're using Sitecore 8.1, we still support MVC areas, and we do so through the same strategy that we used before. This is really transparent to the developer, but we just want to make sure that you understand that things like the MVC area folders, those all still work, and they've been incorporated into Sitecore's strategy. Sitecore also now supports shared and final rendering selection in the visual experience editor, which they didn't before. So in Sitecore 8, we had actually added some of that functionality. What we've done in 8.1, again, is kind of seamlessly make our technology work with Sitecore, so you really shouldn't be able to see a difference. Okay, the next one is a feature that I'm very excited about, and this is a new feature that we adapted into using snippets. Now, as you know, using snippets is a very popular feature in SCORE, but the way that it works is currently when you build a snippet, you're using what we refer to as a reference. And let me jump over into the live demo side and kind of show you what we mean. So here's my Brainjuice website, and I have some global elements, like I have a global header, I've got navigation, some mega menu items, I've got a global footer as well. And as I navigate through the site, I want that header to be the same on every page. So the structure, the look and feel of the header, the content of the header, everything is always the same. And I want to build it in one place, and I want to manage it in one place, and I want to reference it from my pages. So now I'm going to log into Sitecore for a moment, and let's go take a look at that snippet. So in this Brainjuice demo site, if I go down here to the snippets list, I have a list of global snippets, and the site header and the site footer are there. And how that thing is added to the page is using the snippet component that you've all seen before. And when the snippet actually renders in the home page, you can see that it renders in this read-only way. I can't edit it from the home page. I can't change the content because it really only exists in one place. Well, what we found is that there's another use for snippets that we really like, is sometimes I want to capture structure, and I want to be able to play that structure or rebuild that structure in context of a page, right? I want to be able to put new content in it, so I don't want to use the same content over and over again. I really just want to capture that snippet as a snapshot of structure and maybe some boilerplate content that I can start with, but I want to be able to edit that content when I get deeper into it. So what this new feature allows you to do is to kind of capture these patterns and then reuse these patterns throughout your website. So let's do an example. If I go into the Explore section of the Brainjuice website and I go into Argentina, you can see that these pages are somewhat templated. And let's take this little area right here that we call region information that has a lot of lorem ipsum in it, and let's use that as kind of our example piece. Now, if I look at this thing in the visual editor for a moment, you're going to see that this page is actually made out of a lot of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to go into Explore and I'll go into Argentina, and let's take a look around. Now, when I scroll down here, you'll see that this is a 2-column wide left. Inside of it has a lead and then a rich text block. It has another lead that has a class attached to it that allows it to view with a little calendar icon, a style box with a highlight in it with an image selected and some initial text populating it, another style box with a highlight in it with some more text populated. But I want this pattern to exist in a lot of places in the website, but I don't want to have to recreate it. So let's delete it and see what happens, because it's always fun. All right. Now, in the case of running or using a snippet in this new way, what we did is we created a new component, and it's called Run a Snippet Macro. Now, the way it works is exactly like referencing a snippet, except for the outcome. So when I reference the snippet, we know what that does. When I run a snippet as a macro, in this case, I'll run this region information macro. Instead of referencing the snippet in that one place, what it does is it inspects the snippet and it recreates all of the structure and the content in context of the page. Now, because it's recreated it here, it's still editable.
So if any of you guys use branch templates as like a layout, as a template for new pages, this is like branch templates, but for pieces of your pages. That's
right. It's a good analogy too, right? So the other snippet way is kind of, the reference to snippet is kind of like standard values in a way.
Yeah.
And then this is more like a branch template, because once it runs and executes, it disconnects it from the snippet. Mm-hmm. So now if I wanted to edit this, and let's say in this version of it, I wanted to delete this box, or maybe I wanted to restructure this snippet to look different through some other layout of content, then I can do that, and it doesn't affect the other pages, right? So the snippet macro is something that we think is going to get a lot of use. We know that our teams have been getting a lot of use out of it in our own projects.
The next big feature that we want to talk about is workflow. And this is something that a lot of people have asked for. So by popular requests, our SCORE components are now workflow aware. In SCORE 2.0, data source items go into workflow automatically when a page goes into workflow. So this prevents premature publishing of content. And when a page is approved, the SCORE processor looks at all the components that are on that page, and they also they're also approved.
Yep. And we actually added a setting in SCORE that allows you to control if you want that behavior to work on page local data source items, and or site shared content items, and or multi-site shared content items. So you can control the instance and say, here's the items that I want to go through that workflow or not.
And we exposed this feature as a pipeline processor. So if you have any custom logic that you want to do with your publishing, you can patch that in.
Of course. Yep, absolutely. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about very briefly is SSL support. So we've had a number of customers that didn't want a full-time SSL the entire site, but they wanted to SSL certain pages. And some of them wanted to use things like a load balancer, or which might have been sending a header request back or using an alternate port to talk back to the server. And they needed a way to be able to select what pages are SSL encrypted and which ones are not. So we did provide that support in Sitecore or in SCORE 2.0. Now the pages, you can inherit your pages from a page that enables the SSL selection. And you can also utilize a link provider that we've created that will inspect the required settings of each page and generate a fully qualified link with the HTTPS or HTTP as is needed for the link to that page. And the offloading setting also allows you to say, here's an alternate port that a request would come in from a load balancer, or here's an HTTP header that's going to get sent to ensure that the page is actually encrypted properly. And we do have a component that will allow you to redirect the page if someone tries to access it using the wrong protocol. Okay.
We have some new components in SCORE 2.0. We found ourselves building a lot of stuff over and over again as we were implementing Sitecore sites. So we always try to bring that stuff back into our product, to save time in the future. So the new stuff in this release is Google Maps. There's two components for that. One is a simple map, which allows you to drop one pin. Do you want to show the one in Brainjuice? I think you were just on that page.
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Hang on a second. Yeah, so in Brainjuice, we're using, this is actually the map, the single location structure where I can go in. And of course, it uses the custom field type that we created for Google Maps and geolocation to actually plot the latitude and longitude.
And the second of those is it's a map container that allows you to plot multiple points. And so then it renders one map with multiple locations on there. Then we have an add this component, which is a social sharing tool, and modal dialogues, which use the Bootstrap modal, and a composite link, which it works. Well, we've had a button and we had an image button, and oftentimes the designers wanted a button where you can put images and buttons and in all in various orders. So now we just let them have a composite link where they can stick multiple things in any order they want.
Yeah, so these components are designed to work atomically again, right? So if you know how to use a collection like a tab set or an accordion, then you know how to use the Google Map component that allows you to plot multiple locations. And if you know how to use a tab set with an empty kind of canvas on it, then you know how to use a modal dialog. It creates you a canvas, you stick content and components on it, you attach CSS to it and style it, and then you're ready to go. So those are things that should be very easy to use. And you still have the opportunity and the ability, of course, to always build your own components. So if you really like Bing and you want a Bing map on the front end of your site, then of course you can add that component in and no problem. Now, the other thing that we've done with the components is we've adding a lot more support for styling variances. Now, one of the things that we saw quite a bit with teams that were dealing with responsive grid issues is that they were having to create a lot of CSS customizations or classes to those things to create different responsive behaviors. As an example, in this little tile that you see right here, if I were to resize that to a smaller device, the natural responsive behavior would be to take that content and shift it underneath the content on the left. But in some cases, you want it to do something a little bit different, right? So you need to be able to use technology like pushes and pulls through mixins in your CSS. And sometimes I just want to change that responsive behavior. So now within all of those components, structural components, and pretty much every component in the framework, you have the ability to attach custom classes to those components very easily through the editor. And users can make those selections. CSS developers now have more targeting options when they want to change those kind of responsive behaviors. Okay, now the majority of this, we've gotten through all the fun parts. Now
I just wanted to mention that we have styling selections on structural.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so all of the responsive grid components, right? All the structural components, inner structures, page layout structures, all those things now support those. As well as, of course, all the new components as well. All right, now the major topic of SCORE 2.0 is undoubtedly going to be the changes or the introduction of SCORE UI. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time on that. Now, using SCORE in previous versions, there was always two NuGet dependencies that were brought into a Visual Studio solution. Right, one was for the SCORE-based product, and the other one's for the SCORE Bootstrap UI component layer. Now, we planned from the start when we built SCORE to introduce other component layers on top of SCORE other than Bootstrap. We really vastly underestimated how popular Bootstrap was, though. So the demand was so incredibly high, we really never got around to doing Foundation, Zerb, or some others. But we still think that this demand will occur, specifically with the introduction of Twitter Bootstrap 4.0 when that actually comes out in a live environment. So the idea would be that when I scaffold a solution with SCORE, I should be able to pick the UI framework that I want to use for a specific project, and we still want to have that ability. Now, what we noticed when we started building the Foundation Zerb layer was that there was a lot of functionality in the core components that we needed to replicate to others. Things like navigation, like how navigation works and how it builds menus or menu structures. So we didn't want to have duplicate code, so we decided to refactor a lot of those elements out into Score UI. Now, Score UI gave us actually some new inspiration. We started looking at components in a different way, and we're going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about that.
So as we'll see in a few minutes, Score UI brings a lot of new Sitecore items and C# classes into the mix. So I just wanted to touch very briefly on why we thought that doing this was worthy of bringing in this extra layer of complexity into Score. So we all know that Score can be used to build websites out of the box. It provides plenty of components that lets you do a lot of stuff. But at its core, Score is a development framework for Sitecore developers. And here at Brainjocks, we use Score ourselves to build Sitecore sites. So we understand that no matter how many components are at Score, there will always be a need for building custom stuff. And of course, everybody wants this to be quick and easy. So with that in mind, I take you to Sitecore's rendering definition item. So in Score 1.5, our MVC models read and parsed all incoming data from the component, including fields on the data source item. Oh, I don't have my mouse here. And fields on the rendering parameter items. So that is the parameter template field here and the data source template field.
Yeah, even for the view renderings, that was always kind of our strategy, right? And we went through a couple of different iterations on how to structure those models. But in Score 2.0, we've made some dramatic improvements.
Yeah, so what we realized as we were using them in 1.5 is that this created an implicit dependency between the data source item and the rendering parameter item. And because the MVC model expected them to come as a pair. So if you wanted to switch out one of the items, a new model has to be created.
So in other words, if I wanted to use a different rendering parameter template or a different data source item for a rendering, then that model would no longer work.
Yeah,
right?
you would have to create a new MVC model.
In the model, they were dependent on one another, and we wanted to break that dependency.
Yeah, because the model is processing both.
Yep.
Oh, that's how it was in 1.5. So Sitecore lets your renderings mix and match the data source of rendering parameters however you want, since there are separate fields here. And 2.0 allows the same mixing and matching in the MVC model. So here's what's in Score UI. It provides a set of templates for the component data sources, a set of templates for the component rendering parameters, and templates for the component style selection folders. And then in the backend, in the C#, it has a set of classes that know how to read and parse those data source items. Same thing for the rendering parameters. And then a base class for your MVC models to inherit from, which use generics to mix and match the data source and parameters together.
That's awesome.
And when we say that we created a lot of them, we mean a lot. So this is all that's available in Score UI, and we have API documentation for this on our website, and we'll show reference links in the end of this presentation, and then of course, we can always send them out. So this is the base class in Score UI that MVC models should inherit from, and it has 3 signatures that can be used. So you don't have to use both rendering parameters and data sources. If you just want the parameters or nothing, then you can still inherit from this model. And it also does some interesting stuff under the hood, like reads, scores, show, hide fields, which controls the visibility of components based on the size of your device.
Yeah, the goal, remember that when you're developing in Score, you know, this is an opinionated thing, but we think that all components should have that kind of base functionality, because in a responsive design, I might need to be able to drop a component off based on device or something like that. So we want to make it very easy for you to utilize that functionality without having to create a lot of boilerplate code or follow a certain pattern. So we want to make it a lot easier for you.
Yeah. So all Score components should inherit from this MVC model, because it will have those Score features just baked in automatically. So in Score Bootstrap, what we had to go through all of our MVC models and refactor them to use this new strategy. So our models now, they use a class, a separate class to process the data source fields and a separate class to process the rendering parameter fields. And so if you wanted to extend a Score component, you could also mix and match the data sources and the rendering parameters and implement the same strategy.
Now, I know everybody reads our documentation.
Of course, it's so much fun.
But this is actually documented, and we show the different strategies, like if I wanted to mix and match existing parameter classes or custom item templates, or if I wanted to just inherit from the base classes, how would that look like?
Yeah.
So the Score documentation under MVC now has kind of a series of these scenarios and shows you exactly how you would do that and provide some sample code on each one of those strategies.
Yeah, that's another one of the links that we'll show in the references slide, because Brian wrote some great articles that exemplify this. But then we'll show some more examples later on. So the other big thing about Score UI is CCF, which stands for Component Communication Framework. And this is the JavaScript layer that's part of Score UI.
Now, all developers are going to be able to relate to this, right? As you move more toward MVC, JavaScript becomes infinitely more supportive and becomes more important. And when you're creating, if you're creating just a content site, maybe content components do everything that you want, but it's highly likely that you're going to require JavaScript to do some more interactive elements, create a deeper user experience. And consuming JavaScript into Sitecore creates a lot of complexity, right? Especially when you're dealing with a component architecture. Making sure that components have those kind of dependencies, et cetera, is very important.
Yes, so there's some challenges that we had to solve. So, I mean, why do we even need a JavaScript framework? And the main thing is that the components, sometimes they need to talk to each other and exchange data. In the Brainjocks site that Brian was showing on the search page, and I'll show it in a second actually. Here, I'll just switch over there now. Here on this search page, we have 3 independent components. So this search box is a component. The search results here is a component, and the faceting filter is a component. So as I interact with these, so typing something here needs to update the results here. It needs to update the counts in the facets. Selecting a facet has to update what's on the screen here. So all of these have to communicate with each other, yet they have to be independent so that I can place them wherever I want.
Yeah, your first desire might say, I want to wind this up into one big monolithic component, right. But then it can't be rearranged. It can't be, it's not very design friendly at that point. It's very hard coded to a specific structure.
What if I don't want all 3? What if I just want the search results and a search box? Here, they obviously had to be separate because the search box is in the header. I mean, crazy style people thought of this up.
Designers.
Yeah, those designers. So that was the big challenge number 1. And then as the UI gets more complicated, you want to start breaking it up into true architecture. I mean, you don't want to just have one giant monolithic JavaScript file. You want to have JavaScript models and behaviors, and you want to start structuring it like you would a .NET project. You want to pull in third-party libraries. So basically, you want to be able to, you want a way to declare dependencies and have a clean structure, not just everything in one file, because that's impossible to maintain.
And also using things like Knockout.js and
that's a third-party
other frameworks.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very popular thing that the people want to do.
Yeah, so how do you do that?
Exactly. How do you kind of pull those dependencies in correctly, right? And correctly is the key to that.
And how do you pull them in and not have your version interfere with the version that Sitecore is using, like the jQuery and prototype, all the stuff they were using.
We've all experienced that.
On a page, we don't know what components are going to be on a page when it loads. So how can we make sure that we only load the JavaScript that we need? Because we don't want to load everything for the whole entire application. And if you have the same component on a page multiple times, how do we make sure that the JavaScript file for that component is loaded once, but run multiple times for each component in the scope of that component? So that's the challenges that we faced, and that is what CCF solves. So I already showed you how it works. CCF right now has two big sections. The first section is the module loader, and the second section is the event manager. So I'll talk about the module loader first. So the module loader is the piece that's built around required.js, and it is how we get our nice fancy JavaScript into our Sitecore. So once we decided that we want our JavaScript clean, we don't want to build it inside of the views. We want it all in external files so it can follow best practices and have good architecture. So we have in separate files. So now what do? How do we get it into Sitecore? And how do we pass parameters to it from our views? Because we'll need to pass data to it from our MVC models.
And if you haven't spent time with required.js, you know, understanding how AMD works in JavaScript is definitely worth the investment of time. Mm-hmm. Right. So
AMD stands for asynchronous model definition defining. So there's a lot of documentation out there on required.js. So we're kind of glossing over that part, assuming that you guys can read about that later. Their website is great, but required.js handles the ordering the modules so they're loaded in the proper order once you define your dependencies in the files. So anyway, in your views, all you as a developer have to do is use Score UI's HTML helper extension to tell it the name of the module that you want to use. You can pass it optional parameters, optional HTML attributes, but
essentially it connects the component to its JavaScript dependency.
Yes, so you use this HTML helper, and what it does is it produces CCF-friendly markup that the module loader knows how to consume. So that connects your view to your JavaScript modules.
Now, the great thing about this is, number one, you don't have a lot of JavaScript bloat, because in a component architecture, if you think about it, what you're kind of forced to do in a way is to declare the JavaScript and the layout document that all the components might need, that any component might need. In this case, if I want the carousel JavaScript, it's only going to get loaded if I add a carousel to the page, right? So I don't have to worry about that being loaded on every page. And I can also ensure that if I put 5 carousels on the page, which nobody would ever do that, but if I did, then that JavaScript's not going to be loaded multiple times. It's only going to be loaded once because it's all that's needed.
So, and the only thing that you do have to do in your layout is pull in a required.js config file, which all the ways that could be set up is explained in required.js documentation. And then in your main JavaScript entry point file, you have to declare the module loader as a dependency, and then call module loader load pending modules.
Now, the good news is that our scaffolding has been updated.
Yes.
So that this all already happens.
Right.
The layout documents that we produce are there. And by the way, it's also not required.
Yes.
We don't require that you use require.
Yes, if you migrated your site from 1.5 to 2.0, it will still work. The core JavaScript is not dependent on using AMD. That is just the direction that we're heading. So we are just strongly recommending that all future components are built this way, especially as the UX gets more complicated. But so once you load, once you call load pending modules, what CCF will do is it will look at your entire page for that the HTML that it expects to be there. It will gather information about what modules you want to call and what data you want to pass to them from the attributes that were generated by that HTML helper. Then it will load them. It will continue loading even if one fails. And it will print success failure information to the console, and it will also attach some attribution to the DOM elements about if this module is loaded, pending, or failed, so that you can take further actions if you wanted to. So the second part of CCF is the event manager, and this is how, once your modules are loaded, how do they talk to each other? How how does an action here trigger a behavior here, and vice versa? How do they share data?
You know, maybe we should go to let's go to the Brainjocks product page and kind of talk about the events that are happening on that page. And maybe it'll make sense if they can kind of visually see it, right?
Okay, so here on the product page, these buttons, they trigger an event called a variant selection event, which the actual name of the event is just a string. It doesn't matter. So that is something you can define in your implementation. There are several, does the price change? Yes, so this price component is listening for that event, and it changes price based on the currently selected variant.
The gallery's listening to it too, right?
Yes.
So it's swapping the images in the gallery and the featured image or the selected image.
This is a component, it's a thumbnail strip, it's listening for this change, and so is this guy. The thumbnail strip is not required to be on the page, so if you had a product that only had one image, you wouldn't want to put the thumbnail strip on here. So this main image component is actually listening for two events. It's listening for the variant selection change, and it's listening for thumbnail change.
Now, not that this is a very complex UI, it's not, but keep in mind that what you're doing is you're building this in context of a CMS. So if I wanted to take that gallery strip and move it above the image, or if I wanted to move it over here on the right side, I don't want to hard code those things together. Or maybe I don't want the gallery strip there at all, which would be silly, but maybe I don't want that, right? So by not hard coding those things and making direct dependencies, yeah, I should be able to keep them independent, keep them small, keep them atomic, right? So remember that our component philosophy is based on that principle of atomic design. So the smaller I can make those components, the more flexible the UI becomes to adapt to a design or look and feel requirement. So making components be able to talk to one another becomes very important, because otherwise I don't have that flexibility.
So what do we have to do to get the events firing? Well, in your modules, we have to declare the event manager as a dependency, and then it's as simple as two functions. There's event manager trigger, which takes a string for the event name and an object for your event data. The object could be anything you want. And then there's event manager subscribe, which takes the string for the event name and then a callback function. So, and then CCF takes over from there, and there's some really neat things that CCF does. And that is that it starts to collect triggers as soon as the page starts loading, and then it keeps them in a queue, and then it doesn't start firing. I mean, it doesn't start notifying subscribers about triggered events until all of the modules have been loaded. So that gives everybody a chance to subscribe, and you don't have to worry about, oh, is my trigger on the page first before my subscriber? Those timing issues will all be figured out by the event manager. You want to add anything?
Ooh, oh no. No, that was very good. So you can see that on that variant selection page, if you think about it through the lens of this kind of event bus, as I'm picking variants, that is triggering a variant selection event. Yes. The gallery image component is listening for a variant selection event and then doing something. The gallery thumbnail strip is listening for that event again, and it's doing something. And the image is also listening for a gallery selection event, and when that's done, it's doing something, right? So the events all kind of start with the user's action, but now the components have the ability to talk and respond, and it allows me to also build these things in a very agile way as a development team, which I also like.
Yeah, so now we're going to do some live coding for you guys, and hopefully not see any dreaded error messages. Do you want to set this up for us, Brian?
Okay, yeah, so let's create kind of a fictitious requirement, right? So let's say that on this product page, I want to add some content to the page based on that variant selection event. Like I just want to throw some text up there that shows what variant was picked or something like that, right? So what we want to do is we want to start and build a new component, and then we want to subscribe to that event and see how easy it is for me to respond to that and to place some information back into the page.
Okay. So what I've created so far is just a rendering definition item. It doesn't have any rendering parameters or data source items on it. It just, and a rendering model for it. So that's just, and here is my rendering model. It just inherits from the Sitecore's rendering model, so it's pretty much a dummy rendering model. It just placeholder for now, and here's my view. So what we want to do is wrap our component with the CCF markup so that CCF will know that this is a component that that will be using events, and it will scope the events to the component, and I will show you how it does that.
So we talked earlier about how the view needs to be connected to what its dependencies are, right? So this using statement that she's putting in here is to make that connection. So the first piece of it is this HTML helper, begin UX module. Begin UX module is declaring a JavaScript dependency to a module called panel that's inside of an area of the site Brainjuice demo. And in this case, we'll make the output some basic data, right, based on the selection.
Right. So my goal is to just have a panel that shows the ID of the variant that you selected, because when the variant selection event happens, I know that the selected variant is sent with the data on that event. So I want to receive that variant model and just read its ID. So at a minimum, you must provide the name of your JavaScript, of your required JS module to the helper. So in my required JS configuration, I have said that the shortcut to my JavaScript folder will be called Brainjuice. So that's how I'm able to start here, which is Brainjuice. And as I mentioned, all the options for configuration are documented on the required JS site. So then I need a folder called demo. And I need a JavaScript file called panel. So you can specify the name of your module manually, or we're going to use implicit naming. So if there's no name specified, then require will just use the name of your file as the name of your module. So we're going to declare some dependencies. So we're going to need jQuery, and we know that we're going to need the event manager. So,
and again, we don't want to talk too much about how required JS works, yeah. But it's essentially declaring I'm going to require these modules. So they're registered somewhere as a specific version, and then they're being pulled in this case, into a function. So jQuery is going to map to $, and then the event manager is going to map to event manager. So this is going to be the constructor for my panel module. And what we want to return is a function that the module loader, our CCF module loader, can call to initialize this thing. Now, remember that I said that the module loader can pass arguments from our view to our modules, so that's why it needs an initialization function. Also, since the module loader creates a wrapper element around our components, that's how it knows what the scope of your component is. So one of the things that the module loader adds to this arg's parameter is a property called scope, and that scope is the DOM element that your component lives in. So any kind of jQuery dependencies or
selection that you do inside of your component, you should make sure to keep them scoped to this DOM element, and that's how you will be a nice tenant, a nice sibling to your other components, and not affect other components on the page. So I'm going to return a new panel with args.scope. So this guy, all right. So, let's see, we want to plug something into here. So, let's see, ID, spam. So here's how I'm making sure that I'm only calling the span with the attribute data role equals ID that's inside of this component. And then I'm going to subscribe to event manager dot subscribe.
So the subscription in the event manager, you simply tell it the string, which represents the name of the event that you're trying to actually subscribe to. So in this case, we know that the variant event is called variant selection event.
Yes, and this is something that you defined in your implementation. So, is it variant selection? Yes. So, I know that the event will have the variant on it, the new variant that's selected, which has an ID property that's a special type. So we need to call toString on it to get the Sitecore ID as a string. And then I'm going to plug that into my span. All right, let's build this.
So next step in this, once we get Sitecore to reload, is that we need to go into the page editor and actually add the component that was just built to the page and then test it out.
Yeah. While it's loading, if I was going to build a custom rendering model using the pieces as we talked about, rendering, I would need to inherit from rendering model base in Score UI, and then here's where I would pick the pieces I would want to use. So I can use panel parameters and panel item or whatever else I want to use. So these make sense because we're building a panel. And then this tells me I need to implement a missing member. And then in my view, what this gives me is I have access to the data source item via model.data source, and I have access to the rendering parameters via model.rendering parameters. So I could get, let's say, the class selection here. So whatever you chose for your class selection for your panel styles would be accessible here. If I bet we have fields on the data source. So those could be accessed here.
And if you wanted to use, by the way, Glass Mapper, or if you wanted to still use magic strings inside of your view, that's up to you, right? So those custom items are really just there to help process those values and make it a little easier to deal with without having magic strings everywhere.
If I wanted to pass parameters from my view to my JavaScript, I would do it this way. It's the second parameter, it's the second argument to this method. And then if I wanted to customize the HTML attributes of the wrapper DOM element that this creates, I would specify that here. So model.classes is a property on, oh, because I didn't wrap it in an object. So this is an object. Model.classes is a property on the rendering model base, which aggregates all your class selections and the show hides. So this is what it looks like. Okay, so hopefully this is loaded. Yes, excellent.
Now, you said beforehand you already put it in the placeholder settings, right? So the component was there. We didn't want to walk through the definition of all those pieces.
So when I change the variant, we should see its ID. And we do.
So again, this is a very basic kind of component, but you can see how easy it is to create these kind of messaging structures between components that are in the user experience. And these are not hard-coded dependencies as well. So if that component wasn't there, the variant selection works fine. It doesn't require it to be there. So it's a very helpful thing to have.
So for references, we have some articles that Brian wrote about the new MVC rendering models and all the ways that they can use the stuff in Score UI. And then we have some API references for the Score UI, the building blocks, the data source, and the rendering parameter classes. And then we have some API references for CCF, specifically the module loader and the event manager. And then this is the Require.js website, which has documentation on Require.js.
Okay.
And that's it.
All right, that is it. So excellent job, Anastasia. You did really well. So we have a few questions that we wanted to go over while we had the call still open. And like I said, there's some other questions that have been submitted, and we'll document all that stuff and then get some written answers out. So the first question is, when will the version be released? And Score 2.0 has already been released. It was released at the beginning of February. What you're seeing right now is the current production version that is out there. For users of Score 1.5 or 1.4, we've also provided on the documentation site migration notes, what you would have to do to migrate from a 1.5 to a 2.0 solution. It's not terribly taxing. There's a few steps. And if you wanted to do all the restructuring of your JavaScript, you could do that, but you don't have to, so that's really good. Now, the other thing is that there's another question here, what's in the next version of Score? So 2.1 is going to be coming out actually within the next few weeks. Sitecore has increased their pace of innovation, and we've increased our pace of innovation as well. So when we start releasing, we'll start releasing new versions on a higher velocity as well. You're going to see a lot of features coming in Score that are going to be based on CCF. So there's the teaser for the next release, but there's also some new features around snippets that are just going to make them a whole lot easier to use as well. Okay, so next question we have, if I have a Score request, how do I get it into the backlog? So Score is very much community driven in a lot of ways. We do listen to our community, and a lot of our initial clients gave us some excellent suggestions that are requests that pushed us into different directions. So we're very conscious of listening to the community. If you have a request, the best way to get it to us quickly is to submit it into the support tickets, and then we'll evaluate it and let you know when that's something that we can put into the backlog. You want to take any questions?
Sure.
Good. You can take some. So David Author has a question online. Let me answer this one too. Has there been any changes to the shared final process when editing pages or templates? No, not really. As we mentioned earlier, that Sitecore has that feature now where you can select the shared versus final. So ours gets disabled in standard values and in the branch template. So we don't want to conflict with their feature, right?
So it's nothing that you guys have to do. If you're upgrading your version of Sitecore, there's no, you don't have to change something in Score to make it use our final shared or Sitecore's final shared. Score, it looks at what Sitecore version is being used and then conditionally includes or excludes that feature. So it's just, yeah, it's just kind of there.
Yeah. Now, one thing that's different about the 8.1 feature that's different than our feature is that Sitecore requires site resolving be turned on for that final shared toggle. And when you're editing a template, Sitecore really doesn't have a way to determine what site a template belongs to. We think that we have a solution for this. We're working on that for the 2.1 or the 2.2 release. But right now, if you go into a page, select the shared rendering and go to go to the template, then it'll detect that automatically.
What we're saying is that our way was better.
Our way was better, but that's another story.
When can we have access to the Brainjuice source code? Yeah, you have to contact Charles.
Charles at Brainjocks.com.
Charles at Brainjocks.com.
And bother him.
And,
so
yes.
yeah, we've been asked this many times actually, and so yeah, we're willing to give this out so you guys can actually inspect the code and take a look at the JavaScript that site is using. Should help give you a good implementation idea.
Yeah.
We're also considering introducing an additional class in the SCORE training series, which is going to be focused on advanced component building. The SCORE developer class right now is already slam packed with information, and so we didn't want to add another day, but we do know that there's a demand for this kind of more advanced JavaScript piece, and we want to respond to that demand. So.
And as you said, the scaffolding project has been updated. So if you're scaffolding new sites, then obviously you'll already have the new JavaScript and configurations in there. But if you're migrating from an older version, then you can use that as a reference for what you need to add.
We also said the documentation was updated, and it is, and it also shows links to the most recent public releases. We are still supporting 1.5, we are supporting 2.0, and now we'll be supporting 2.1 within the next couple of weeks. So that is all in the works. Okay. All right, guys, that's the list of questions that we had. What? Yeah, I got it. That's the list of questions that we had. We really appreciate everybody taking this block of time and spending it with us. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us on the SCORE support or through Charles. Oh, wait, there's another question that popped in, so I have like 3 minutes. Any plan for tokenization of data source item? Like in tokenization in terms of search, what are we talking about? Let's see. I don't know what that button did. Anyway, tokenization of data source item. No, not necessarily. I'm not, again, not really sure what the question was about, but if you want to email me or email us, we'd be happy to get into the depths and see what it is that you're looking for as a feature. Okay, guys, that's it. Thank you again for everybody attending. And if there are any other questions, like I said, please contact Charles Bricky, Charles at Brainjocks.com. If you're looking for the Brainjuice source code, he's the man to talk to. And otherwise, we'll look for your questions on the support forum. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.